The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the restless crackle of flames from 1,000 candles inside the great Apache tent. Their light swayed against the animal hides that formed the walls, painting shadows that moved like spirits. The air was warm, heavy with the musk of earth, smoke, and something older, something that belonged to the desert and the blood of its people. On the fur-lined bed, the runaway bride lay still, her body wrapped in a woolen blanket, her breath slow but shallow. She had not expected her journey to lead here, into the heart of a world that was not hers. Under the rule of a man whose eyes carried the weight of storms, the Apache leader stood over her, his tall frame cutting a sharp outline in the candlelight. His chest bore scars from battles long past, each mark a memory of survival, each line a warning that he was not a man to be crossed. He had spoken with a voice steady and deep, one that carried no room for defiance. His words lingered in the air like a command carved into stone. "Go bathe and wait for me." Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it would betray her thoughts. She had run from a life chosen for her, from vows that had never touched her heart. She had thought herself free the moment her horse's hooves struck the open prairie, yet freedom had led her straight into captivity. Now every flicker of the candlelight seemed to whisper that fate was watching, and that her story was only beginning. Outside, the desert slept, but it was no gentle sleep. Coyotes sang beneath the moon, their cries rising and falling like a lament carried across the sand. The scent of sagebrush drifted on the night breeze. The stars above stretched endless, untouched by the troubles of men and women below. But inside the tent, there was no peace. Only the strange meeting of two lives from worlds divided. The bride closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the leader's presence even as he turned from her. She wondered what he saw in her, why he had not let her go when he could have. Was she a prisoner, a symbol, or something he had yet to decide? She knew little of his people, only whispers carried by travelers who spoke of fierce warriors and a land that bowed to none. Yet here she was, lying on their furs, caught in the firelight of their world. Waiting on the will of a man who could change her fate with a single word, she thought of the place she had fled, of the white dress she had abandoned in the dust, of the altar left empty. She had chosen flight over a loveless binding, but the cost of that choice pressed down on her chest. Her hands tightened on the blanket, clutching it as though it could protect her from the storm she had set in motion. The Apache leader stood still at the far end of the tent, watching the shadows with a quiet that unsettled her more than anger ever could. His silence was not emptiness, but strength, the kind born of men who lived with the land rather than against it. His people trusted him, and his enemies feared him, but she could not yet decide which place she held. His command echoed once more in her mind, and she felt the tug of defiance rise inside her chest. But then his gaze met hers again. It was not the gaze of a stranger. It was fire-measured, unyielding, and searching for something deeper. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of being seen. Not as a runaway, not as a bride, but as a soul unmasked beneath the flicker of candles. Her lips parted, but no words came. What could she say? That she had not asked for this? That she had thought freedom meant escape, not surrender? The silence between them grew thick, heavy with things unspoken, till she turned her face toward the firs to escape the intensity of his stare. Yet even with her back turned, she felt it burn. The night stretched on, and with every moment her heart raced louder, as though it wished to leap from her chest and run once more into the wild. Yet she knew there was no running now. The desert was wide, but his people were watchful, and the stars above would guide them better than they would guide her. She was caught not by ropes or chains, but by the command of a man whose presence bound her more tightly than iron. The tent seemed to breathe with her, every candle swaying, every shadow whispering of paths not yet walked. She could not guess what awaited her at dawn, whether it would be mercy, judgment, or something far more dangerous. But one truth clung to her heart. The path she had chosen, when she ran, had led her here, to this place, to this leader, to this command that still echoed in her ears, "Go bathe and wait for me." She drew in a sharp breath, clutching the blanket tighter as her mind raced with questions she dared not ask. Would obeying mean surrender or survival? Would defiance spark fury or respect? She could not know. All she knew was that the night was far from over, and the choices she made now would shape the story she had only just begun. Her eyes opened again, tracing the flicker of flame across the canvas walls, and she realized that her pounding heart was not only fear, it was something else, something she had no name for, something that pulled her deeper into the unknown. She lay awake, waiting, caught between the weight of her past and the promise of a future that frightened her more than chains ever could. As the Apache leader stepped closer once more, the shadows deepened, and the runaway bride felt the desert itself hold its breath. The night had turned to silence again, but this silence was different. It was the silence before the storm, the kind that carried the promise of a story not yet told. The candles flickered once more, and the runaway bride knew that whatever would come next, she could not turn back. The silence of the tent pressed close around her, broken only by the faint hiss of burning wax and the sound of her own uneven breath. The Apache leader moved with deliberate steps, his figure tall and commanding in the glow of the firelight. His shadow stretched across the hides like a spirit from another world, and she could not look away. He did not speak again, yet his presence was louder than words, and she felt as though the desert itself had bound her here to face him. Her chest rose and fell with a rhythm that betrayed the storm inside her. Though she tried to appear calm, he stopped near the entrance, parting the hide flap slightly. A cool night breeze slipped in, carrying with it the smell of dust, sage, and the faint trace of rain that lingered in clouds far beyond the horizon. She longed for the open air, for the freedom of the sky, yet she stayed still. The words he had spoken still rang in her ears, and she could not decide whether they were a warning or a promise. She had run from one cage only to find herself in another, but this cage was different. It was made not of walls or vows, but of a man whose will seemed carved into the earth. Her thoughts wandered to the path that had carried her here. She had grown up in a world built on rules, where decisions were made for her long before she had the chance to breathe her own desires. A marriage had been arranged, a life plotted step by step, and she had felt the noose tighten with each passing day. The church bells had called for her that morning, the dress laid ready, and the guests waiting. But her heart had rebelled. She remembered the moment she mounted her horse, the wind pulling at her veil as the town shrank behind her. The cries of confusion and betrayal fading with every gallop. She had not looked back. She had thought the desert would set her free. Instead, it had led her into the heart of a people she had only ever heard spoken of in hushed tones by firesides. Her gaze drifted back to the leader. His hair hung long over his shoulders, dark as the raven's wing, and his arms bore patterns of scars and paint that told stories she did not yet know. His eyes held the kind of quiet that came from men who had lived through battles, hunger, and the weight of leading others. She realized he was not only a man, but a symbol of his people's strength. They were a nation that endured despite the world pressing against them, and he carried that history in every motion, every word. She tried to read him, to find some softness in his face, but what she saw unsettled her. He was neither cruel nor kind, at least not in ways she understood. He was something else, something untamed, and it frightened her because it stirred something deep within her chest that she could not name. She wondered if he had seen through her already, if he knew that beneath her fear was also a spark of wonder, of dangerous curiosity. Her stomach twisted as the thought grew louder. What did he want with her? If she was only a trespasser, why had he not turned her away, or left her to the desert's mercies? If she was a captive, what ransom could he expect? She shifted beneath the blanket, her skin prickling under the weight of unanswered questions. The tent flap closed softly as he returned to the center. The circle of candlelight wrapped them both once more. His steps were soundless on the rugs, his movements careful, deliberate. He crouched by the fire, feeding it with a small piece of wood, the flames rising higher for a moment before settling again. She watched the way his hands worked, strong yet precise, like a man accustomed to shaping not only weapons, but also decisions that carried the weight of lives. When his voice came again, it was low, almost thoughtful. He spoke of the desert, of how it tested all who crossed it, of how every choice carved a path that could not be undone. His words were simple, but they carried a depth that sank into her bones. She listened, though she barely understood why he was telling her these things. Perhaps it was a lesson, or perhaps a warning. Her lips trembled with the urge to speak, but she swallowed the words. She feared that any sound she made might betray her weakness. Yet silence was no shield. He turned his gaze to her, and the firelight caught the sharpness of his features, the depth of his eyes. She felt pinned beneath that stare, as if he could see the truth of her heart before she had even dared to face it herself. The night stretched longer, and the world outside the tent seemed to fade. She thought of her family, of the faces that would now carry shame and anger at her flight. Perhaps even now they searched, following the trail of hoofprints across the prairie, hoping to drag her back to the altar she had abandoned. The thought filled her with dread, but also with a strange relief. Whatever awaited her here, it was not the cage she had fled. Still, fear pressed close. She was among strangers, in the heart of a camp that was not her own. Under the watch of a man whose words commanded obedience, her choices had brought her here, but now it felt as though she had no choices left at all. She gripped the blanket tighter, her knuckles pale, as though clinging to the last piece of herself that remained untouched. The Apache leader rose from the fire, his shadow long against the canvas walls. He moved closer, each step measured, until the space between them felt like the narrow edge of a cliff. She drew in a sharp breath, uncertain whether to shrink back or to hold her ground. Her heart raced louder, echoing the very words that had set this moment into motion. "Go bathe and wait for me." The command was not forgotten, though she had yet to move. She wondered what he would do if she defied him, if she chose to stay where she was, wrapped in the furs, refusing to bend. Would his anger rise like a storm, or would he only watch her with that same silent intensity, waiting until she yielded? The thought burned inside her, both fearsome and strangely defiant. Her throat tightened, her voice locked away. She could not yet speak, nor could she move. The candles wavered, the fire hissed, and the night grew heavier. His eyes lingered on her a moment longer before shifting away, as though he had seen all he needed for now. Yet the weight of his gaze did not leave her. It clung to her skin, to her breath, to the pounding of her heart. The night outside deepened, the cries of coyotes fading to silence, replaced by the slow hum of the wind through the desert brush. She wondered how many others slept nearby, warriors who trusted their leader to guard their dreams. She wondered if they knew she was here, lying beneath his watch. Caught between her own choices and his command, she turned her face toward the fire, her eyes tracing the flames, searching for courage in their restless dance. She knew that the path ahead would not be simple, that every moment would test her spirit. Yet even in the fear, a spark of determination stirred. She had chosen to flee once, and she could not regret that. Whatever came next, she would meet it with eyes open, even if they trembled with doubt. The Apache leader stood silent again, his presence filling the space like the desert sky, vast and unyielding. She could not tell if he was waiting for her to rise, to obey, or if he was testing her spirit by letting the silence stretch longer. Either way, the night would not give her peace. The runaway bride closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her pulse drum steady and strong. She was no longer at the altar, no longer bound by vows she had not chosen. But what she faced now might be a test far greater than any she had known, and as the candles burned lower, the fire casting its last shadows across the tent, she knew that this was only the beginning. The true storm had not yet broken. The night pressed on, thick with silence, and though her body ached from the days-long flight, sleep refused to come. Each flicker of the fire carved new shapes against the walls of the tent, and every shadow seemed alive, watching. She lay still, her mind caught in the tension of choices she did not yet understand. Across from her, the Apache leader moved with a patience that unsettled her more than fury ever could. He was not a man who wasted words. Yet his silence spoke louder than anything she had ever known. Beyond the tent, faint sounds drifted in from the camp. The crack of logs, the distant call of a night bird, the muffled laughter of warriors gathered by their own fires. She wondered if they spoke of her, the runaway bride who had stumbled into their world. Did they see her as an intruder, an enemy, or something else entirely? She did not know, but the thought twisted inside her until her chest felt tight. The leader rose at last, his figure tall and steady as he stepped closer to the tent's flap. For a moment she thought he might leave, and the idea brought her a strange mix of relief and dread. But instead he paused, his hand brushing against the leather tie that held the flap closed. His voice came low and steady, carrying the weight of command, though not unkind. He spoke of strangers wandering into their lands, of how trust was not given but earned, of how every soul who entered their circle carried the responsibility of respect. His words were not aimed at her as punishment, yet they felt like a test, as if he were measuring whether she understood the gravity of where she stood. Her throat felt dry. But at last she found her voice. She told him she had not meant to trespass, that her only wish had been to escape a life she could not bear. The words tumbled out faster than she meant them to, her voice shaking yet steady enough to hold his gaze. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable, and when she finished he nodded once, as if he had expected this answer all along. Still, his eyes narrowed with something deeper. He spoke again, and this time his words carried another layer. He told her the desert did not welcome weakness, that freedom was not found by running, but by standing firm in the face of storms. She heard the weight behind his words and knew he was not only speaking of her flight from marriage, but of something greater, something tied to his own people and the struggles they endured. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and she felt the tension coil tighter. Was he warning her that she would not find sanctuary here unless she proved herself? Or was he trying to teach her something she had yet to grasp? Her heart beat faster, and though she longed for clarity, she sensed he would not give it freely. Later, when the leader left the tent, she lay awake in the dim light, her mind turning in circles. She thought of her family, of the vows she had abandoned, of the eyes that would never forgive her. She thought of the desert, of how it had led her into this strange new world. And she thought of him, the leader whose command bound her more tightly than the vows she had fled. By dawn, she had not slept. The camp stirred slowly, smoke curling into the air from morning fires, voices rising in a rhythm of daily life. She stepped out from the tent at last, the sun bright against her eyes, and for the first time she saw the camp in full. Children played near the edge of the stream, women tended fires, men carried bows and rifles polished from years of use. All moved with purpose, each life woven into the fabric of the tribe. She felt out of place, a thread that did not belong, yet also drawn to the harmony of it all. The leader's voice carried over the camp as he spoke to his people. She could not catch every word, but she recognized the authority in his tone, the way the others listened with respect. Her gaze followed him as he moved among them, his presence steady, his words measured. She realized then that he was not only a man, but the pillar upon which these lives leaned. It struck her with both awe and unease. Whispers followed her as she walked past. Some eyes watched with curiosity, others with suspicion, and she felt each one like a weight upon her shoulders. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, wishing she could disappear into the earth, yet knowing that hiding would only make her seem weaker. The children, unburdened by fear, stared openly, their small voices asking questions she could not understand. Later that day, she learned more of why she had been kept. A messenger arrived, breathless from the ride, speaking quickly to the leader and his council. Though she could not understand every word, the urgency was clear. Trouble stirred beyond their lands. Riders had been spotted, men searching the desert, and she knew in her heart who they were. Her family would not have let her go easily. They would have sent men to drag her back. Men who saw her not as a soul with a choice, but as property bound by duty. The realization made her chest tighten. She had thought her greatest fear was the leader who now held her fate in his hands. But perhaps the true danger was the past she had tried to outrun. If those men reached the camp, what would they do? Would they come with weapons, with threats, with the arrogance of those who believed the land belonged only to them? She looked at the leader then, his face sharp with thought. his eyes scanning the horizon as though he already sensed the storm approaching. The days that followed brought more unease. Scouts returned with reports of riders drawing closer, their movements restless, their intent unclear. At the same time, she began to notice the tension within the camp itself. Some of the people watched her with distrust, whispering that she might have brought danger with her. Others showed a quiet sympathy, though they dared not voice it openly. She felt caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, yet bound to both by the thread of fate. At night, she lay awake again, the fire's glow painting the tent walls. The leader's presence lingered even when he was not near, his words echoing in her thoughts. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A burden, a stranger, or something else entirely. The uncertainty gnawed at her until she found herself longing for answers she feared to hear. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain across the desert, she overheard part of a council gathering. Voices rose in debate, some urging caution, others calling for action. They spoke of enemies drawing near, of how the camp must prepare. Her name was not spoken aloud, yet she felt its weight in the silence that followed each pause. She knew she was part of the conflict now, whether she wished it or not. When the leader emerged from the council fire, his expression was darker than she had yet seen. He met her gaze briefly, his eyes steady, before turning away. That moment told her more than words could. The choices ahead would not be simple, and her presence here was no longer only her burden. It was a spark that might light the fire of something far greater. The desert night grew heavy again. The coyotes calling in the distance, the flames casting restless shadows. She sat awake, staring into the fire, her thoughts racing. She had fled a marriage, fled a life that suffocated her spirit, only to find herself standing on the edge of another storm. The men who searched for her would not stop. The tribe would not yield. And in the middle of it all was her. The runaway bride whose pounding heart told her she had stepped into a story she could not yet escape. The leader's words returned to her. Heavy with meaning she was only beginning to grasp. Freedom was not found by running, but by standing firm. The truth of it unsettled her, for she knew that soon she would have to stand. Against her past, against the storm drawing near, and perhaps even against the man whose presence bound her as tightly as any vow. The fire hissed and cracked, throwing sparks into the night, and she knew the desert was listening. Somewhere beyond the horizon, riders pressed closer, carrying with them the world she had abandoned. The tension grew sharper, the silence heavier. She realized the storm had already begun. The desert night no longer felt like a blanket of silence. It had changed into something charged, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for what was about to come. Every sound seemed sharper. Now the shuffle of hooves on the sand, the faraway call of an owl, the restless flick of firelight against the hides of the leader's tent. The runaway bride sat close to the flames, her body tense, her eyes refusing to close, though her strength had worn thin. She could not rest, not when she knew the riders who hunted her were drawing closer with every passing hour. The Apache leader moved like a shadow just beyond the fire, speaking quietly to his scouts and warriors. Though she could not make out every word, she understood enough to know that preparations were being made. The camp was alive with quiet urgency, bows strung, rifles checked, horses tied closer to the center. Every man carried the weight of what might arrive with dawn. She watched them, each face set in determination, and she wondered how her presence here had thrown their lives into such turmoil. Her heart twisted with guilt. She had wanted only freedom, yet her flight had led others into danger. But there was no undoing the path she had chosen. Now the question was not whether she had changed her fate, but how far the consequences would reach. The leader turned toward her then, his face calm, though his eyes carried the fire of thought. He spoke softly, reminding her again that the desert did not forgive weakness. His words pressed against her heart like a weight, but she found no anger in them. They were not spoken to wound her, but to prepare her, though, for what she could not yet see. She felt the truth of it sinking deeper. She had run far, yet now the moment had come where running would no longer save her. As the night stretched on, tension thickened. The scouts returned with news that the riders were no longer distant. They had crossed the ridge by moonlight, moving faster, their tracks clear in the sand. At most, a day remained before they reached the camp. The leader's warriors murmured among themselves, some urging to strike first, others insisting on defense. The bride listened, though she did not know which side of their debate frightened her more. Either choice meant blood. When the council ended, the leader came to sit by the fire. For the first time since she had been brought into his world, she saw something almost human slip through the shield of his strength. His shoulders carried more than command. They carried the lives of every soul in the camp. She studied him quietly, wondering what it meant for a man to lead with such certainty yet bear such weight. He did not meet her gaze, but she felt the air between them tighten, as if words hovered there that neither of them dared to speak. Sleep never came. By morning, the camp stirred with an edge sharper than usual. Women gathered children close, men rode out in pairs to patrol the land. The sun rose hot, burning against the sand, and the air shimmered with heat. She stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes searching the horizon, knowing that somewhere out there, men who had once been her family's allies now hunted her as a fugitive. The leader approached, his presence commanding even in silence. He handed her a water skin and told her to drink. His tone was steady, but beneath it was a hint of something else, an unspoken awareness that she was not only a stranger, but the very reason the storm approached. She took the water, her hands trembling as she drank, and for a moment their eyes locked. She thought she saw a question there, though it was one she could not answer. The day passed slow, stretched taut by waiting. Every sound of wind through the sagebrush felt like the approach of hooves. Children's laughter was quieter, men's voices carried sharper tones. She walked through the camp, feeling the weight of eyes upon her. Some held suspicion, others only curiosity, but none looked at her as though she belonged. That truth pressed heavily on her heart, reminding her again that she was caught between worlds as the sun dipped low. Painting the sky in streaks of fire, the first signs appeared. A hawk circled high above, its cry piercing the silence. The scouts returned, dust rising behind their horses. Their faces were carved in urgency. The riders were near to near. By nightfall, they would be within reach. The leader gathered his people, his voice firm and strong. He told them to ready themselves, to trust the desert and their own courage. His words stirred the camp like a rising wind, and though fear lingered in their eyes, so did resolve. She listened, her chest tightening. This was no longer only her fight, though she had never wanted it to be. She had pulled them into her story, and now they would pay the price. When darkness fell, the camp was a sea of whispers and shadows. Fires burned lower, weapons lay ready, horses shifted restlessly. She sat again inside the tent, her hands folded tightly, her body rigid with fear. The leader entered briefly, his eyes fixed on her. He told her that whatever happened, she must remain strong, that fear would break her faster than any chain. His words struck deep, leaving her with more questions than answers. Did he believe she had the strength to face this storm? Or was he only trying to prepare her for the worst? The hours dragged heavy. The sound of hooves came faint at first, carried by the wind, then clearer, louder, closer. She rose to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught between terror and defiance. The camp stirred with movement, warriors gripping their bows, children gathered in silence, the women clutching them close. Every soul felt the air change. The leader stood tall at the edge of the firelight, his figure cast in shadow against the rising moon. He lifted his hand, signaling silence. The riders were near enough now that dust rose faint in the distance, shapes beginning to form against the horizon. Her pulse raced, her body trembling. She knew this was the moment her past and present would collide. She thought of the vows she had fled, the life she had abandoned, and the faces of those who now sought to reclaim her. She thought of the leader's words, of strength, of standing firm. The weight of it pressed against her chest until she felt she might shatter. Yet she knew she could not run again. The desert was watching, the people around her waiting, and her fate had been tied to theirs, whether she wished it or not. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady as thunder rolling across the sand. The fire flickered wildly, shadows leaping high against the tents. The runaway bride stood frozen, caught between fear and resolve. Her eyes locked on the dark line of riders that drew closer with every breath. The Apache leader stepped forward, his hand gripping his weapon, his posture unyielding. The night was alive with tension, the air so thick she could barely breathe. Every sound, every flicker of light, every beat of her heart pulled tighter and tighter until it felt as though the world itself might break. The riders drew near, their shapes now clear, their voices faint but rising with menace. The camp stood still, waiting. Every soul balanced on the edge of what was about to come, her hands clenched at her sides, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on the horizon. She had run far, but the past had caught her. Now the desert held her in its grasp, the leader's words echoing in her mind. Freedom was not in flight, but in standing. The hoofbeats thundered louder. The shadows of the riders stretched long beneath the moon. The leader's figure stood tall at the front of his people, and in the flicker of the firelight, the runaway bride felt the moment crash upon her like a wave she could not escape. The night broke open with a sound that seemed to tear the desert in two. The hoofbeats crashed like thunder as the riders surged closer, their silhouettes dark against the silver wash of the moon. The Apache warriors rose as one, bows taut, rifles gleaming, the firelight flashing across their faces like a storm waiting to strike. The runaway bride stood frozen at the edge of the tent, her breath caught in her chest, her body trembling as she watched her past and present collide in a way she had never imagined. The leader raised his hand, and silence fell over his people. Even the horses stilled, as if they too sensed the gravity of the moment. The riders slowed as they neared the camp, their torches flickering, their voices sharp with anger and certainty. She recognized the tone before the words reached her. These were men sent not to search, but to claim. They shouted her name into the night, demanding her return, their voices heavy with ownership, not care. Her stomach twisted at the sound. These were the chains she had broken, the vows she had fled, now riding toward her with fury. She wanted to shrink back into the shadows, to vanish before their eyes, but something inside her rooted her to the ground. The leader's words came back to her again, quiet but strong. Freedom was not found in running. It was found in standing. The leader stepped forward, his figure tall against the fire. His voice cut through the night, calm but commanding. He told the riders they had crossed into his land, that no soul was taken from his camp against their will. The men shouted back, claiming she belonged to them, that she was bound by promises made in another place, under another sky. Their words stabbed at her like knives, yet she felt the truth of her heart rise stronger. She no longer belonged to them. The standoff stretched heavy as stone. Every moment felt like it might explode into violence. The Apache warriors held steady, their bows aimed, their rifles firm. The riders shifted uneasily, sensing the strength they faced. In that tense silence, the bride felt the weight of choice press upon her chest. She could remain hidden, letting the leader speak for her, or she could step forward and claim her own voice. Her legs trembled, but she moved. Slowly, she walked past the firelight, her figure revealed to the men who had hunted her across the desert. Their voices rose in shock, in anger, in demands that she return at once. But she did not flinch. Her voice broke free, clear though shaken. She told them she had chosen to leave, that the vows they tried to bind her with had never been her own. She spoke not only for herself, but for the truth she had long kept buried, that no life built on chains could hold her spirit. The words silenced even the riders for a breath. She saw their faces twist in disbelief and outrage. Yet she also saw something else, hesitation. They had expected fear, not defiance. They had expected surrender, not resolve. The leader stood behind her, his presence steady, his people unyielding. In that moment, she understood that her voice, trembling though it was, had shifted the balance. The riders argued among themselves, their torches flickering as they debated whether to strike or retreat. But the desert was not theirs. They could see it in the unbroken line of warriors standing before them, in the unbending figure of the leader, in the voice of the bride who no longer belonged to their world. One by one, they pulled at their reins, their fury sharp but powerless against the truth that faced them. With curses thrown into the night, they turned their horses, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. The camp held its breath until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did the tension break, the silence giving way to the crackle of fire and the low murmur of voices. The bride's knees weakened, her body heavy with the weight of what had passed, but she did not fall. She stood, her chest heaving, her heart pounding, her spirit trembling but unbroken. The leader's gaze found hers. He did not speak at first, only studied her with eyes that seemed to see deeper than words could reach. At last he nodded once, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. She had stood when she could have hidden. She had faced what she feared most. She had chosen her own voice. The days that followed carried a quiet different from the storm before. The riders did not return, though the camp remained watchful. The people looked at her with new eyes, no longer only suspicion, but something closer to cautious acceptance. Children no longer whispered in fear, and women offered her food without hesitation. She was still a stranger, but no longer only a burden. She had begun to carve her place among them, though she knew it would take time. She often walked to the edge of the desert, staring out at the horizon, where her past had vanished into dust. Sometimes guilt whispered to her, reminding her of the family she had left behind, of the anger she had caused. But each time she felt the weight of that guilt, she also remembered the night she had found her voice, and the strength that had risen when she thought she had none left. The path behind her was broken, but the path before her was hers to walk. The leader spoke little of what had passed. He was not a man of many words, yet his presence was steady, his guidance subtle. She found herself drawn to his strength, not as a cage, but as something that gave her courage. He did not tell her what to be, nor did he demand her obedience. He only reminded her, again and again, that freedom was not found in fleeing, but in facing. She carried those words like a stone in her heart, heavy yet grounding. As weeks passed, the desert changed. The rains came, soft and rare, bringing life to the dry earth. The camp flourished, children laughed louder, the air filled with songs and stories at night. She listened, learning their ways, their history, their bond with the land. She realized that this place was not built on chains, but on resilience. Not on ownership, but on trust. It was a truth she had never known before, and it settled in her spirit like water in parched soil. Her own story was still unfinished. She knew the past might rise again, that shadows could return, that freedom always came with trials. But she no longer trembled at the thought. She had learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand in spite of it. One night, as the fire burned low and the stars spread endless above, she lay on the furs inside the tent. The leader sat across from her, silent as always, his eyes fixed on the flames. For a long time neither spoke, the quiet carrying more weight than words could. At last she whispered a simple truth, that she had run far to escape chains, only to find that true freedom was not in the running but in the standing. His eyes met hers, steady, and for the first time she thought she saw the faintest trace of a smile. The desert sighed outside, the coyotes calling in the distance, the wind stirring the sage. The runaway bride closed her eyes, her heart steady, her spirit unbroken. She had fled one world and found another, one not bound by vows she never chose, but by courage she had discovered within herself. The story of her flight was over, but the story of her strength had only begun. And as the fire burned into the night, the desert kept its watch, silent and eternal, holding her truth within its endless horizon.